Do you suppose we convince him to talk without the mask?
Yeah.
Yes,
Be a little,
thank you, Dr. Dunn. Let's take our masks off so that they
All right,
can,
well, I'm fully immunized, have been for a long time.
have him. So have I. Probably most of us have had the shots or the virus. And yes, I think that's great. It's good to see you.
May I make an opening remark before we start?
Yes, you may.
I'm certainly honored to be asked to be here, and it's always good to be someplace when we've been cooped up so long to see some of my old friends that I don't see very often.
I agree.
And I'd like to apologize for another thing. I only lived here till I was 19 years old and didn't come back till I was 60. So I only know people like Dr. Wagner and the people I grew up with, and I don't know any of their children because they had their children. They grew up and were gone before I ever come back. So the only people I know and the only things I know is what happened while I
Before
was
or after.
a young man and a teenager and
Right.
very
But what
little
you
sense.
did as a young man before you went into the Air Force is very interesting. So that's a big part of our story of Burlington. Go ahead. Was there anything else you
No,
wanted to say?
that's all.
Okay. As you said, now you were born in, you're 91 now, as I recall.
That's right.
So you were born in 1930.
30.
Okay. 1930. I couldn't get my math going there.
My father bought a house across from the Christian church, not very far from here, in 1929 for $500.
Really?
And he gave $100 down and made payments on it, and because he was just starting out in his married life, and a year later
Yeah.
I was born in that house.
Wow.
And
Now, did you kind of grow up in that the Christian church there?
no, I grew up in the Brethren
In the
Church.
Brethren Church. Well, I thought that's what I had
I
heard.
was baptized there when I was 13 years old.
In the Brethren
The
Church.
baptistry that's still there to this present
But
day.
you are now a member, I think, out of faith, aren't you?
I am.
Yes. So he's got a history in our churches in town too, and but let's go back even before that. Well, not before that, but one of the questions I had was where you worked. What kind of jobs did you have when you were young?
Well, when I was young, I started out pretty young. I was driving a team of horses when I was 8 years old.
8 years old, he was driving a team of
I
horses.
was never old enough to walk a walking plow. Had I been born a year or two sooner, I would have, but I couldn't handle a walking plow. But I grew up there, and then I worked for Fred Klingenpeel on a farm when I was around 8 or 9 years old. Remember, the tractors didn't have rubber tires back then.
They had those lugs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I worked for him for a while, and I also worked for the block plant here in Burlington and Austin.
Really?
Yes.
So that's old. That's really old. I didn't realize it was that old. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I worked there for a very short period of time because I got my heel caught under a little tram that they used to move those blocks and broke my ankle.
Oh,
And was driven to Young America to a doctor over there. We didn't have a doctor in Burlington, and said it, and that's one reason why my feet don't line up exactly
Well.
the same.
well.
And I was probably 10, 11 years old when I was working.
Well, you've done well considering you had that kind of injury that young. Yeah. And then when let's see, you worked for. Let's see, you mentioned a Beamer, Klingenpeel and Beamer.
Yeah, we worked on the hay baler, Bud McLaughlin, or Bud McArath, and Marion Klein. She was 16 years old, and she drove the tractor, and Bud McArath was 12, and I was 14 when we baled hay.
Wow, wow.
And lots of it.
And then when you were a teenager, well, then you started working for Star Roller Mill.
That's right.
Yes. And then also as a teenager, you worked for Erman's Cafe.
Some,
Remember when it was Erman's Cafe? Before it was the Dinner Bell?
well, most of the young girls in Burlington worked there
Worked there.
at one time or another.
Yes,
And I worked there some of nights and sometimes on Sunday. I didn't work there a lot, but I did work for Lester Erman and
Yeah.
Grace.
wow, okay. So you've had all kinds of jobs here in Burlington.
And the nice thing about the hay baling, when it rained, Marion and Bud McElrath, they didn't have anything to do, but I could go to work at Star Roller Mills. I packed flour most of the time when I was there.
Right, right.
Young boy.
So you've had varied experiences. And then you graduated from Burlington High
Yes, I
School in, what was the year?
did. 1948,
28.
48.
48.
48.
48, yeah.
And I remember Beulah Stonebreaker. She was one of our teachers and a hard taskmaster. And then there was a fellow by the name of Bill Tyson, and every kid in his class always got a spanking, and sometimes a girl too. They couldn't do that today, but we had to stand on our tiptoes and put our finger or our nose in a ring.
Really? Really?
I could sometimes have to stand on one leg.
Well,
I remember Byron Phillips. He was a principal's son. I can remember him standing on one leg, and every time he'd drop that leg, he'd get another swat with a paddle.
oh my
And Bill Tyson kept his paddle wrapped up in the funny papers, that came on Sunday. And I can remember him saying to me, if you don't straighten up, you'll be reading the funny papers. That you was going to get a paddle.
That's what, you knew what that meant, didn't you?
And I did get one.
Did you?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting punishment they had back then. They wouldn't allow that today, would they?
No, but we learned a lot of discipline from those
Yes,
teachers.
we did, yeah. It was not a bad thing.
No, I don't hold that grudge against Tyson. He walked with a limp. I don't know why, but I don't know. Do you remember him, Doc?
Who?
Bill Tyson?
I don't remember Bill, no.
He probably was gone by that time, but Beulah Stonebreaker just lived here across the street. And she was taught Latin, I remember.
Well, that was back when they taught Latin.
Yeah.
Did you play ball? Did you play,
I
did you play against Cutler?
did. I think so, yeah.
There might have been enough age, you're not quite that old, so you might not have played each
No,
other.
I'm sure they played against Cutler.
We played Carrollton and Flora, and when Johnny Barber was here, Burlington had an outstanding basketball team, and then about 1946 they had a good team, Max Brown and Jack Grant, and I can't remember all the boys, but there was a bunch of them on there and they were good, and Flora went to the state that year.
Well,
And Flora only beat Burlington, and the 3 times they played them, a total of about 3 or 4 points. And,
well, then Burlington wasn't all that bad.
well, Bob Cripe was the outstanding player at Flora, and he won the Tressler Award that year. They was in the final of the state tournament, and Max Brown always had a grudge against Bob Cripe because they won it by 1 point just at
1
the
point.
tail end of the game, and
Wow.
Max Brown always contended that the time was up when he fired the shot.
Oh, so they contested that last basket that was made, huh?
Bob Cripe became a longtime friend of mine until he passed away,
Good.
and he'd always bring that up. You tell Max Brown that
They didn't really win, huh?
within the time limit, but I know Max, he didn't think so.
Did Johnny Barber play during that?
Pardon?
Johnny Barber, didn't he play at Burlington here?
He was before that, Doc.
Was he one before that?
He was the coach, didn't you say?
44.
Yeah, they had a good team then.
I don't remember.
Snyder was on that, Keith Snyder and Johnny Barber and Tug Sutton and that group of guys. They were all Second World War men. You had to be 3 years older than me to have served in the Second World War.
I learned that the way that Burlington got its name, the
Polar Cubs?
Polar Cubs, was because their gymnasium was up above what is today the Dock Restaurant. was Irma's Cafe. It was up above that restaurant and didn't have any heat. And I forget which team it was that came to play, and it was so cold up there upstairs. They said, "Who are we playing here? The Polar Bears?" And that's how they got their name of the Polar Cubs, because the gymnasium was so cold.
My father played in that facility.
In the cold one.
1927, along in there sometime, 26.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, then after those jobs, then you went into the Air Force.
Yes.
And tell us where you served and what you did.
Well, I enlisted and was sent to Lackland Air Force Base in Texas, and 14,000 men came in there at the influx of the Korean War, and they couldn't handle them all. And everybody had diarrhea. They was bringing in food from Mexico, and we had men sleeping in drained swimming pools, and they were pitching tents. And I was always particular about my hair. Max Catron, the barber here, always cut my hair. And I had ducktails back then and coal black hair, and I couldn't wait to get a haircut because we couldn't take showers. We'd have to be marched over to somebody else's barracks every 3 or 4 days to get a shower. And toward the tail end, they'd march us over to the supply depot, and once we got full complement of clothes, we could leave, you know. And so I wanted to get out of there, and I'd take any size they had. You know,
Yeah.
they'd say, "What size do you wear?" And I'd say,
Right.
"What size do you have?"
What you got?
And I was only there 18 days, and then I went to Keesler Air Force Base, and I was to
Mississippi.
start radio school there. And while I was being drilled, I twisted an ankle, and they had a class starting the next day, and they said, "Since you can't do anything else, you might as well start to school." So I did that, and consequently, I'm one of the few servicemen that I've ever met that never had any basic training.
They kept you on a basic training.
I didn't have
Well,
any.
yes, that's true, because they all have to
Yeah,
have that.
just a little marching around and but I started a 32-week radio course there that was condensed to 28 days because we went 6 days a week
Well,
instead of normal 5, you know. And then when I graduated, I was anxious to get out of there and start in as a radio operator, and then they informed me I was going to become an instructor because I had graduated in the top 2% of my class, and that was mandatory that
yeah.
I become an instructor, so
Yeah,
I went to
right.
another 10 weeks
So then,
of school.
is that what you did in Korea?
Yes, I was an airborne radio operator.
An airborne, so you were in the air doing the radio operating from
That's
air?
true.
In what kind of airplane?
I'd be 26.
26, my goodness. Yeah. So now when you came out of the Air Force, or did you start before, you went to Purdue
I did.
for 3 years.
That's,
And you got your degree in just 3 years.
That's true.
How did you do that?
well, it was hard.
You worked.
I was motivated. A guy by the name of Dean Fender down there told me he thought I was too dumb to go to Purdue, and he fought me all the way every year when I would sign up, because you had to carry 22 hours a semester in order to graduate in 3 years.
Oh yes, that would be a heavy load.
And he was a motivating force, you know. I wanted to prove to him that I could do that. And
So it worked in your favor, his comment.
and so,
Now you got 2 degrees. What were they?
yeah, I have a master's in finance.
In finance.
Uh-huh.
Okay. And the
From
bachelor,
Syracuse, New York.
Syracuse University in New York. So you went on to school there then?
Well, the company sent me there. I went there, the privilege of Central Soya Company. They sent me there, and I'd have to go in the summertime for 3 weeks and do that for 3 years. And it was a very intense situation.
It would have been.
Resulted in a master's in finance, and they paid the bill. I had to give
Now-
up a couple of weeks of vacation in order to do that, but that was all right.
we have to back up a little bit because